Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congressman Rush, for inviting me to testify this morning on the origins of the crude oil export ban, which ironically was enacted nearly 40 years ago. Given the profound changes that have occurred in unconventional oil and gas production that we've already heard about over the last 6 years, I think it's important to look back and remind ourselves how our energy situation has evolved since 1975. In the years prior to the OPEC oil embargo, the chief issues dominating energy policy in the United States were debate over the future of nuclear power, especially whether we should recycle plutonium and develop the breeder reactor, price controls on domestic oil and natural gas, which I remind you were enacted by President Nixon back in 1971 out of concern that inflation had reached the dangerous levels of 4.4%. And various programs, both a voluntary oil import program and a mandatory oil import program to hold down oil imports as a protection for our domestic industry. In reviewing this history, and this is a critical point, what stands out is, just as is the case today, most energy issues were discussed in isolation from one another. On the geopolitical front, the early 70s saw momentous changes in the Middle East and North Africa, as King Idris in Libya was deposed by Colonel Gaddafi, and in response to a decline in real oil prices, the major oil-producing countries mounted a unified campaign against the petroleum companies to extract more of the economic rent from their oil production. Under two major agreements negotiated in Tehran and Tripoli between the international oil companies and OPEC, the OPEC, concerned about inflation and a general sense that they were not being treated fairly by the international oil companies, demanded a major increase in the price of their oil. After these two agreements, OPEC was able to introduce an escalation clause in its contracts that it believed would protect their members from inflation. This proved, however, not to be the case. But what helped OPEC was, as Mr. Sheminsky noted, was the surging demand worldwide, not only in the United States, but in Western Europe and Japan, which allowed OPEC to, every time a contract was up for renegotiation, demand further upward price revisions. Mr. Chairman, it is worth noting that the global market conditions in the early 70s could not have been more different than they are today, as we heard from Congressman Barton. Demand for oil throughout the industrialized world was skyrocketing. In the United States, domestic production had peaked in 1970, leading a cabinet task force to recommend the gradual elimination of the quotas under the mandatory oil import program. In retrospect, given the changed circumstances confronting the U.S., it is remarkable that this recommendation did not receive more salience from the Congress, despite the fact that U.S. oil consumption was skyrocketing, domestic production was peaking, and oil imports were up to nearly 30% of U.S. consumption on the eve of the oil embargo. The U.S. could not have been more ill-prepared for the embargo. In response, one of the primary actions taken was enactment of complex regulatory procedures for oil and gas prices, as well as an incredibly complex system of allocation controls, leading to gasoline lines in the districts and surplus supplies in Potomac. Unfortunately, these were so ill-conceived that they accentuated the impact of the crisis and exacerbated gasoline shortages, causing long lines for angry motorists buying regulated volumes of fuel. And I'm glad the congressman got 10 gallons, because as a graduate student, I only got 5 gallons in New England. In response to the crisis, President Nixon launched Project Independence, designed to eliminate oil imports by 1980, when comprising a host of initiatives, including the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. Under EPCA, the President was granted the authority to restrict exports of coal, petroleum products, natural gas, petrochemical feedstocks, and supplies of materials and equipment for the exploration, production, refining, and transportation of energy. EPCA also authorized the President to exempt crude oil and natural gas exports from such restrictions where doing so was deemed by the President to be in the national interest. As the Act today only relates to crude oil, the main exceptions that have been made are predominantly for shipments to our neighbors in Canada and Mexico and recognition of our historic trading relationships. Other exemptions to the ban are noted in detail in my formal testimony. Today, through modifications to EPCA, the U.S. allows unrestricted exports of all fuels except crude oil. And natural gas has to go through a cumbersome regulatory procedure, but it is not banned. The only express ban that remains today is on crude oil. In reviewing the history since the early 70s, it is apparent that whenever the U.S. government has tried to favor a particular fuel absent market realities, there have been unintended consequences which have been deleterious to the U.S. economy and to our national energy security. Controls on natural gas prices led to the failure to develop the Alaska natural gas transportation system, creating massive natural gas shortages in my home territory in the industrial Midwest in the winter of '77-78, with devastating economic impact, some of which remains to this day. The ban on using oil and gas in industrial boilers and power generation led to a major switch away from gas and oil towards coal. This rush towards coal has led to scores of aging coal facilities that now have to be replaced as part of our national environmental policy and our international climate policy. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, it is evident that the U.S. energy situation today is far different from what it was when EPCA was enacted. With crude oil production continuing to rise, it would be detrimental to U.S. energy and economic policy to keep the ban on crude oil exports. Keeping the ban and attempting to manipulate policy to control a globally traded commodities with hopes that the U.S. oil boom will lead to energy independence is a fallacy, as the U.S. is part of the global market and must therefore participate in it. Lifting the ban will generate paramount foreign policy benefits. It will increase U.S. GDP, and Brookings did a major study on this issue that's on our website if anyone cares to look at it, and it will reduce unemployment, all of which will be foregone if the ban remains in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.